All right, all right. Well, welcome to the Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. And I'm confused right now. I think we're on episode 38. So we're coming right along. We're even on 38 or 39. But I'm very excited. I'm here with Marya Wright. And we've been trying to connect for a while now, for like 3 or 4 months, and we both got busy. And so I'm very grateful to have you finally make it here on the show. How are you this morning?
Oh, I'm great. Thank you, Christian, for having me. And yeah, life's been lifing, but I'm happy that we were able to connect, and I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, and Marya, I'll give her, when you're listening to this, you'll have heard the formal introduction, but she is a clinical social worker, she's a professor, she's writing a book, she's into child welfare, she's into all sorts of things, and so we're going to see where the dialogue takes us, but again, I'm very excited to have you here. You're in California, right?
Yes, I'm in California. I'm in the Bay Area.
The Bay Area. So what's the weather there?
Oh, it's gloomy today. It's rainy, cloudy, cold, all the fun things. But, you know, I'm okay with it because I'm from Northern California. So I'm used to this weather and I'm okay with it. But it's nice. It's nice.
Yeah, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Northern California. I've been to Santa Cruz a couple times. And just a couple years ago, my family took a road trip and we went through Reno and Tahoe and then came down through where we just drove through San Francisco so we could check it out. But is it true, you know, like the stories, is it foggy every morning and then it kind of lifts? Is that...
Yeah, so a few things. One, like a Northern California reference and Santa Cruz don't go in the same sentence.
Say that one more time?
A Northern California reference and Santa Cruz do not go in the same sentence. Like Santa Cruz is like way south of Northern California. So like I'm from Eureka, Humboldt County, like almost Oregon. Santa Cruz is like hours away. But as far as fogginess in San Francisco, yes, San Francisco is like the foggy city. It's always foggy and overcast in the morning. And then it does lift. And there are some really beautiful days and amazing sunsets over there.
Yeah, right on. I think my thing with Santa Cruz is, you know, I'm mostly familiar with Southern California, like from, you know, San Diego up to Los Angeles County. And so anything north of that, I just have always viewed as Northern California.
Oh, I get it. I went to San Diego State University, and so I experienced that a lot, where people were like, oh, you're from like Northern California. Like, you know, they just think like everything above LA is North California. And then when you live in the Bay Area, then they know like true North is like there's more stuff above. So California is really long, and anyone that, you know, like other people, they look at it and they're like, oh, Northern California. They're like, oh, I'm going to California. I'm going to LA, and I'm like, great, like LA's hours away.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit similar to the way people perceive Alaska.
Right.
Because sometimes people are like, we do this. I was like, you got to realize, you know, Alaska's huge. Alaska's like big as half of the United States. So when you're asking me these questions.
Really? When you said that earlier, I was like, what do you mean Alaska's huge? It's a dot up there.
Yeah, no, Alaska's huge. Alaska's, you know, they say Texas is the big state, but I think we're over twice the size of Texas.
Wow.
You know, we were talking before we went live, we were talking about up north in Barrow, Alaska. It's called, the traditional name is Utqiagvik, but on the Arctic Ocean. And, you know, they're in 24-hour darkness right now. But a lot of people will ask them, I hear like the Inupiaq, you know, a lot of people refer to them as the Eskimos, but Inupiaq's the right term. And they'll say that, you know, when they go down to, they call it the lower 48 or the continental United States, and everyone wants to ask them about igloos and fishing and all this stuff. And they ride polar bears to work. But, you know, they often think about them like they're down in the south in the fishing areas, right? But they're like literally 1,500 miles north of that, you know what I mean? And so even when you're talking about Alaska natives, or, you know, people, the term often people use is Eskimo, but, you know, Alaska's huge. So there's like a myriad of different kinds of Alaska native people, different cultures, different backgrounds, you know, that would have been separated by thousands of miles before colonization and whatnot. Well, I mean, they're still separated, but connected now by roads and airplanes and whatnot.
That's so interesting. So they call us the lower 48?
Yeah, you know, we're up here.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. Hawaii too, for some reason, even though they're down there. Sometimes they call it the lower 48 or the continental, or the they get both Alaskans and Hawaiians get offended when you refer to it as the mainland. It's not the mainland. What do you mean it's the mainland?
I totally would have said the mainland, like the main, like there's more of us over here, like the main group.
That's all true. But, everybody likes to don't want to think of themselves outside the main.
Oh, of course. No, they're definitely a part of it.
Outside the mainstream, which I guess is even more of a big deal in California. And, when I grew up, it was always the joke of California was like keeping up with the Joneses. But what's interesting, we're way off the topic of social work so far, but I grew up in Utah, and, I'm getting old now, so I'm 41. I grew up in like the 80s and the 90s. And back then, it was before internet for the most part and all that stuff. So we were largely disconnected. So in a lot of ways, we looked up to California because if California had the music first, it had the style, it had the fashion, all of those things. But now, like, especially post-pandemic, lots of people from California have moved to Utah.
Oh, yeah.
Utah, to me, is, especially if you were comparing it by, like, a couple decades ago standards, I mean, it basically is on the equivalent of California, if that makes sense. It's just extended.
Yeah. I see that.
So when I go back to Utah, it's like it's different for me because it used to be so spread out and depopulated, and there weren't many black people, for example. And now it's, when I go visit family, the demographics are changing. There's apartments everywhere.
That's cool.
It's crazy. It's just like I remember going to California.
Right.
Well, let's talk about social work. So what made you want to, because when you were getting your own education, you were interested in child welfare, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And what I will say is that this is pretty much social work, right? If you think about the generalist practice model, it's important to engage, the person first. It's important to build some rapport and get some background information, do a little biopsychosocial first to get to know who you're talking to see how that shows up and how they the discussion and perspective. So those listening, this is how you do it. And, you're always going to have an agenda of things you want to talk about or like a direction, but it's good to like take a moment to build that rapport. So I'll just say, Christian, you're doing it. It's still social work. You're building that rapport. But as far as child welfare, I don't know if I knew the term per se, child welfare, as to that's what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to work in child protective services, and I wanted to be there for children and be there for those that didn't have a voice in situations where they needed support. And so all of my education, formal education, is in social work. And I've always, within that, have had a concentration of going into child welfare services.
Yeah, and we were talking again before we started recording, but I was telling you about a friend of mine that I had on the podcast recently, Haki Shakur, and he was reflecting about child welfare, and he's in Virginia. But he was reflecting that I know he doesn't speak for every black person in Virginia, but he was saying that basically the consensus among black folks in Virginia was that they didn't trust child welfare workers or even social workers to a degree. What's it like for you? I mean, as far as in California, what's the sentiment these days?
Absolutely. Well, I identify as a black woman, and I would agree with him. They don't, and they shouldn't, and I support it. And even when I was working in the system, I've recently left child welfare. I experienced a decade working inside the system. Now I work on the outside as a private social worker, still working with the same community of clients, but now on the outside in my own capacity. And I would agree, it is not a system that black people can, initially trust, and they shouldn't trust, and they have good reason not to trust. Evidence, research, life experience says that the system is set up to work against them. That the system is not going to be supportive and doesn't understand or support their way of parenting or their community of engagement as far as parenting goes. And so it makes complete sense why historically and currently the black community does not trust child welfare workers. And the thing is the distinction between the child welfare system and those who work in it and a social worker and the capacity of what a social worker can hold as a professional is misconstrued in society. And so oftentimes it's just like, anyone that knocks on a door, hands out a welfare check, or is in the community advocating for somebody in need is a social worker. And the society isn't able to distinguish between what actually is a social worker and unfortunately, some of the positions where a degreed social worker should be, they hire just about anybody to hold that position because they need to fill those positions. And so it really taints the social work profession, and it really gives a oftentimes negative viewpoint on who social workers are and how the community should perceive us. But I would support his claim, and I believe him, and I feel the same way. And that's exactly how I interacted with my clients, knowing that the system's set up to work against us, and that as a person inside the system, on a consistent daily basis, I'm working up against that for my clients.
Yeah, and one thing I want to talk about that is implicit bias, but let's put that to the side for just a minute.
You got it.
So when I was getting into the field of social work, before I even really knew what the field of social work was, I just kind of naturally, I was a troubled kid, troubled young adult, ended up working with youth myself. And I had this position called a youth advocate back in the days. And basically, I worked with children that were placed into foster care. And children is a loose word, I guess, say adolescents, like teenagers. And I think when you're younger, you view the systems in the world, and most of us kind of view it, especially white people probably view it in, like they're doing the right thing. You got to have trust in them and whatnot. But when I was a youth advocate, something that really stood out to me that caused my mind to didn't make sense for me was okay, so you're taking these kids out of a home, sometimes because their homes are really bad and there's really bad things going on there for sure. But then I saw where they put them. And so sometimes it would be in a group home, which is not the group home that I worked with wasn't like the worst place in the world, but it definitely wasn't where I would, if you were taking my kids, I would be very upset if you put them in there. And then even further than that, I'm just going to use an example. I had two Latino boys that both came from families that had problems with drug dealing and gang-related stuff like that. And they put them into these old white folks' home that were LDS Mormon. And I'm not saying that you can't mix religion and stuff. I'm not saying that at all. But they would force these kids to put on church clothes and go to church every Sunday. And they would tell me they hated it and they didn't want to go. And I ended up being just kind of like this middleman that advocated for them. But the foster parents couldn't even talk to the kids. So it would be like this. They'd have to call me, "Hey, Christian, can you come over here? We had this happen, and so they won't listen to us. Can you come?" And so, to me, for one, the forcing the religion on them in a place that's already, homogeneously religious, Utah, Mormons, LDS. So it can already be uncomfortable for folks that don't fit in to those kind of things. But also putting them just with some folks that were I think their biggest culprit was they were just old, if that makes sense, and they didn't relate to the kids at all. Like I said, they're from a homogenous society that fits in with them. And so ultimately what they were trying to do is get these Latino kids from a completely different world to adhere to the standards that they had and that they believed in and that they raised their children with. And the bottom line is it just didn't fit. Yeah. And so I know I didn't really ask a question, but I just want to know what your thoughts are on those situations.
Absolutely. Well, being a youth advocate or, in anything like that, youth advocate, parent advocate, or support like that, peer support is evidence-based programming where that works, right? That's so important and very necessary. And I hope that is something that, is more consistent across the board when it comes to child welfare. It's unfortunate that, the only way that people get assigned that is if it's referred. It's not like an automatic thing. And having someone who either has lived experience or has an understanding of the lived experience be there to support that client is so valuable. It's really unfortunate, though, because I've seen it myself. And even, in 2023, we're removing a child from a home where it's unfortunate what happened. Yes. But where are we placing that child? In a very much more unfortunate situation. Again, I've experienced child welfare across the state and internationally, and throughout the United States. And so I've seen it in different capacities. And it is very frustrating. And I have vocalized and spoken out in the moment of when we're removing a child from a home where we could instead try to stabilize, provide psychoeducation, information, and intensive supportive services in the home. But instead, we remove the child because we are reactionary and we need to immediately provide a safety response in this moment to concerned risk. And so remove the child. And then I've seen where the child then gets removed and gets placed into a receiving home, if you will. And in that receiving home, there are several other children who have more egregious trauma impacted experiences and behaviors. And so now this child is being re-traumatized by being around other children and in a receiving home. And it's almost worse off. And in fact, I have seen it become worse off. And so when I was working in this system, I would tell parents, I know this is hard. I know what's happening is really unfortunate, but because it's a weird paradigm. What I've experienced over the last few years is that this understanding of child welfare is now we're here to save and support and fix children, and we don't. And so I would explain to parents no, I want to keep your child at home with you, please, because if you send your child to foster care because you don't want to deal with your child anymore, it could actually end up worse. Or I would do extra work after that removal, because I wasn't a removal worker. I was right after. I was a court worker. So I would do extra work to try to get that kid home sooner, as soon as possible, so that they would spend the least amount of time in a foster care setting. Or find ways for, instead of removing a child, remove an adult, right? Remove the actual concern in the home setting. And several times was I able to do that successfully and support a family, either reunifying as soon as possible or returning a child as soon as possible.
Yeah, and so for indigenous folks, for Alaska Natives, for American Indians, Native Americans, they have ICWA, right?
Yes.
Indian
Child Welfare Act.
Indian Child Welfare Act. So for those of you that don't know, I mean, in a gist, it would say it was basically in reaction to many Native kids being taken from their home in foster care and whatnot, and being put outside of their tribe, outside of their culture, outside of everything. Oftentimes with white parents, and so with ICWA, they have to do everything that they can to try to place them with a Native family or with a family within the same culture. But I'm actually asking this question because I honestly don't know the answer to that. Do they have anything in place for other folks, like Black folks, for example, to ensure that? And I'm not, I don't want to completely overstep the line because, and say that that there can be no good interracial experience. I'm married to a Black woman, and my kids are interracial and whatnot. But obviously, there's a problem, because, and we'll get to the implicit bias in a second. But obviously, there can be a problem removing children from their home and placing them, like we were just saying, with folks that they're not going to, let's just say folks that they're not going to relate to. Let's leave it there.
100%.
Is there any protections in place in that regard?
Oh, this is a great conversation. So first, I want to discuss ICWA. And I really hope there's social workers and child welfare workers listening to this. Please stop asking your clients if they have ICWA. Nobody in America understands what ICWA is. Nobody, not even graduated social workers. Nobody understands the term ICWA. Ask your clients if they have Native American ancestry. Ask them if they, belong to a tribe, if their family belonged to a tribe. Actually ask your clients the question. Please stop asking them if they have ICWA. They don't. They don't know what ICWA is. ICWA is a law. It's an act. It's a legislation. It's a protection. They do not understand what it means. And it frustrates me to no end when I find out that my client was asked if they have ICWA, because they don't. ICWA is not something that you have. It's not like a tangible thing. Are they Native American? Yes. And can they respond to that? Yes. And I've had situations where clients were asked if they have ICWA. They said no. And then when it comes to me in the court, we realize that they actually are Native American and they have their card and they have all the things. And now it's like, so please, 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 community of social workers, ask your clients the actual question, engage in conversation with them, because we cannot miss a single Native, Indigenous individual and child entering the system. They deserve it, they need it, and they have the protection. As far as other communities, I have not seen anything to that sort. What I do know is that we and my colleagues over there do try very hard to place language needs with the children that may have, they may speak, Spanish, Mum, Mandarin. We try to place, those children with a caregiver who can communicate with them, because the barriers that you shared with your client in Utah is unfortunate, and it does happen. As far as the Black community, no. I know that there are often efforts to recruit community and providers and caregivers who are Black, so that there are those options. But the likelihood that when placing a Black child, considering are there Black caregivers is not something that I've heard in discussion, no. Now, when I look at the Indian Child Welfare Act and the supports that are there, I wish that we had some of those same protections as it relates to reunifying families and that support. But no, it is a legislation that is one of its kind, and I wish it was replicated to support other communities as well.
Yeah, and so. Just to frame it, I view myself as an abolitionist, meaning like
Yes.
I don't really believe in locking people up, period.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we're at a place in the present moment in just using broadly American Western culture, to where we've produced violent individuals, people that have violence, that act out violently, all kinds of people. But we're at this place, and so that's always the question, right? Like, so if we're such a incarcerated state at this point, have the highest incarceration rates probably in history, but definitely in the world right now for any, what we would consider Western civilized nation, however you want to describe it. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we move forward on that? And I don't know what your personal views are regarding like abolition or decarceration or anything like that.
Yes.
But what do you think about that? Like, what is our step forward to get to a point where we can be less incarcerated, less of a carceral state?
Yes, it requires us to acknowledge and to, acknowledge the fact that we're reactionary and that we're so fearful of having these conversations. We're so fearful of just acknowledging that the system's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And in today's presence, we don't want that anymore. The people that created it and designed it, they succeeded. And now those people are no longer around. We have an abolitionist culture. We have people like us that are like, we're going to speak out against it. We're not shying away from it. And there needs to be a major shift in it. What it's currently doing and what the systems, child welfare, criminal justice system. I include the education system in that. Oftentimes when we talk about systems, we only look at a couple. I include education system in there, the medical system in there, right? Because medications aid, the substances, the prescribed substances, and the mental health substances, like mental health services. So these systems, they need to be redesigned. And there's such a fear of how can we do that? What is that? And there's so much like tape around being able to do that. So it's like, just get rid of the whole thing, because if you don't want to redesign it, it's not working for the people that are here and now. In fact, it's further perpetuating the trauma. It's further perpetuating the violence, and it's causing our community to be reactionary to the system. It's caused them to be resistant to it because they're like, that's not for me. I don't want it. It's harmful to my community. History tells me, research shows me So I'm going to resist it and I'm going to be violent towards it because it's been violent towards me. And so until we just like have moments of like, okay, that is what it is, we're going to continue to want to ourselves abolish it, get rid of it, and just like scrap it completely because it's doing more harm than good. But it's doing exactly what it was intended to do. That's why we just kind of got to just scrap it.
Yeah, I heard that. I heard a Ta-Nehisi Coates said that somebody asked him about like why is it working this way, and he said, "What do you mean? It's working exactly as it's intended to work." And also,
I've actually had that conversation. I was working with a single black father in East Oakland, and I stood on his doorstep and I said, the system that I work for is set up to work against people like you. It's set up to work against the single black father. And I'm here to just let you know that I know that, and I want to make sure that you know that I know that. So let's do everything that we can moving forward to work together to work against it. And it took me a couple weeks, and I returned his daughter to his care.
what happens when you what's the word, when you empathize with someone like that, when you reflect what they may be thinking and feeling, but the rest of the world sometimes tells them that they're full of shit or that does that, you know what I mean? How do people respond to that?
They're like, okay, she gets it. She's real. She's raw. She's, she's fearless. She's on my side. I can trust her. The deepest level of rapport that I can have with the client comes forward. The information and support that the client, responds with shows that like, okay, we can get somewhere with this. And I often have really successful client outcomes because of that. And so, for me, it's important. It's part of my social work pedagogy of like how I engage and how I communicate with clients. I don't ever want a client to sit with those type of feelings or emotions, or for them to for it to be like an unconscious thought that they have. I want it to just be able to surface and kind of like bubble away. Like, like when you start to boil water, the boiling always starts below and then it comes to the surface and like it starts to like evaporate. Like for me, like I like to let those things come and like experience and like process forward, because as long as my clients feel those things internally, it actually impacts their ability to engage in the service, right? So like if we think about like research and like what it's shown is that when there's a stereotype threat that's impacting somebody, impacting their thoughts, their brain, their emotions internally, it actually impacts their working memory, impacts their ability to their executive function, their ability to engage in the service. So as long as my clients are sitting with that, they're going to have a really hard time to engage in that case that I'm working with them on. And so I know that when I'm knocking on their door and I'm on their doorstep, I am in a very hierarchical position of power, and I don't like that. And so what I do, and I intentionally do, is try to find ways to bring myself down, partner with the client, collaborate with them, and let them know that this is the position I'm coming from. I know the power that I hold. And so let me show you how I'm going to utilize that power to communicate with you and support you having a outcome that is in your favor, either while I'm working with you or later down the line.
It sounds a lot like you value being upfront and honest.
100%.
Why is that?
Why not? So many things can happen if you aren't. Miscommunication, a lack of understanding. I value clarity, and especially in situations like this. The child welfare system moves so quickly that if like one misstep can really cause like longevity of turmoil. So for me, I was a dependency investigator. So I was a court worker. I'm on very strict, very quick timelines. And so we don't have a whole lot of time for like wiggle room or like things not happening. And so any wiggle room that I have is me building rapport with a client and engaging a client. I'll take as long as I need for that, because what I've realized is when I have engaged my clients at that deep level, then the work after that moves really quickly, almost every time. I had a client one time, again, Deep East Oakland, a family, believe 8 or 9 children. It was like a blended household. I got around to most of the homes in the school, in the community. I got around to most of the schools in the community. Then I got to the home to see the rest of the children. Knock on the door. Parent opens the door, hooting and hollering. Give it to me, whatever you got. Like, I'm here for it, right? Like, because if you knocking on my door, I'm hooting and hollering as well. So I get it. That doesn't faze me because that's what I expect, right? I'm like, yeah, you should be upset. Like, you should be irritated that a system is knocking on your door. I don't expect any parent. That's why I tell my students, I'm like, why would you expect them to be welcoming to you? You're the system. So for me, I'm like, okay, like I'm, and so I'm just sympathized. I said, you know what? I said, I'm raised in a Black family. I get it. Like if they knocked on my door, I would react the same way. So I understand, Mom, right? And I'm talking to her. We're not the same culture. This is a Hispanic, Spanish-speaking family. I said, I get it. And so, she was resistant. Dad was resistant. I'm just receiving. I am a vessel for them. And so, and so we're communicating and we're talking, and I'm like, you know what? These people deserve to know what my intentions are on their doorstep. I said, the system that I work for, the agency that I work for expects me to do this, this, this. And that's exactly what I said. I said, they expect me to see all the children. They expect me to come into your home and do a full home tour. And they expect me to go back and write up, the discussions and stuff, right? So I'm communicating with them exactly what the steps are. Because I don't like to hold on to that stuff. I just like, why? Like, just tell them what you're going to do with what the communication is. And so, once I built that rapport with them, before you know it, I have a full house tour. I'm talking to all the children, and, we had a great visit. But 20 minutes before that, I could, have gone to hell. So, it's just really, for me, communicating, not holding on to information and sharing with my clients. I've done a lot of work and studying and self-examination work around the white supremacy culture and just thinking about power hoarding. And so once I truly, truly understood that, my power hoarding tendencies that are ingrained in me because I'm raised in Western culture, I'm raised under the white supremacy culture, so power hoarding is a natural part of it. I released it, right? Because I'm like, anything that I know and the intentions that I hold, my clients should know that as well, and they do.
Yeah, I like how you put that in. It can be so hard to succumb to power. Obviously, I think that's, if you look at the history of the Western society, that's like, you could find that story repeating itself over and over again. And you also had me thinking about, the trope of, knock, knock, knock. Hi, we're the government. We're here to help. Oh, yeah, right. That's the insider joke for
Yep.
many of the people in the world.
Yep.
Well, I thought maybe we could circle over to implicit bias. Well, there's one comment I wanted to make about what you were saying earlier about when we were looking at the future of being a carceral state and whatnot. And I liked, it felt like you were using your imagination a little bit in there, and like we don't know the exact answer. But when I had the privilege of taking a class with Angela Davis. She guest taught our class for the semester as a visiting scholar in Hawaii, and that's one of the things that she would say, because a lot of people always ask, well, like, what is the answer? How do you get there? Even they ask her the question about, violent offenders or whatever that I said, but she always says something similar along the lines of, well, if we don't talk about it and we don't use our imaginations, how will we ever create that world, or how will we ever get there? And so I really appreciate, that you're going down that road and you're talking about it, and, you're using your imagination, because it's the only way forward. And we're not there, even when Angela Davis started thinking about those things, our incarceration rates they've gone the opposite way that she wanted them. They've continued to skyrocket, and so we've got to continue to do that work. But I wanted to circle back to implicit bias. We've been talking about going back to, say, taking a non-white child and, say, putting them into a white home. And I'll just use that old white Mormon couple as an example. I think that when I looked at them, that they were doing it for what they thought were the right reasons. I think they wanted to help the kids. They viewed themselves as people that could, host some children and, teach them the right way to live, and they thought that they could do that. And I think that, obviously I don't know what's in the hearts and minds of these individuals, but I think when I look at it, and, I think a good place to start is just by my own personal experience and my own issues. is that there's so much implicit bias that's there that folks don't even know about. And I think when we get into the conversations of racism, oftentimes, you hear people, hey, you know what? I don't have any problem with whatever black people or whatever group we're talking. I don't have any ill will or whatever. But then if you sit in a conversation with them later, you hear all these, these ideas that are not true. Mm-hmm. And I empathize with those people too, because that shit's been rammed, into their soul for a long time now.
Yeah.
But we have these implicit biases. I used to, as a teenager and young adult, and even now, but back then, many of my friends were Black, Polynesian, Latino, Native American. Mm-hmm. But when I really look back to those times, that's when my bias and my racist ideas were at their highest. Now, I didn't have any ill intent. I didn't mean anything bad by that. But yeah, they were still there, and they affected the way that I looked at things, and especially the way I initially reacted to many things and interpreted different things. And I don't want to get into too many things, but when I look back, and even when I look in the present, I'm not saying I'm like, a pure individual, 100% pure individual today, but I have done a lot of work, and so, I've moved forward in that regard. But I think, growing up in this world, the things that we're told, the education we receive, the shows that we watch, the advertisements we consume, music we consume often, we're just filled up with these ideas, and to confront them can be really hard, right? Like it can be, because then you feel, we're so adverse to guilt oftentimes, and I don't even think guilt's the answer. I think action and reflection and answer, reflection and action are the answers. But, how have you seen that play out especially in social work, but especially in child welfare? I think that, and I think this plays into social work too, right? The same sentiment I said of these old folks. You have a lot of people that get into social work, they want to make a difference. They want to, but it becomes paternalistic or maternalistic to where we're, trying to bring them into our world and our standards. And, I used to even supervise, when I was still in Utah, I supervised a residential treatment facility. We didn't have Utah kids. We had a couple black kids from California, but most of the black kids were from back east, like D.C., Philadelphia. And then we had Native American kids from Hawaii, Alaska, South Dakota, Montana. And, they'd send them to Utah. And again, I think most of the people that worked at the facility had really good intentions. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just like all white people. There's a lot of Polynesian folks that worked there. There were black supervisors. But ultimately, they were sending these kids there, and the implicit bias of everyone put together, it was again, Utah was just a mostly homogenous place in the way that people view the world. They'd have these kids that had nothing to do with that, and we'd bring them in there and, expect them to become or adhere to their cultural standards or to our cultural standards, however you want to look at it. And so how have you seen that play out, Like, well, let's back up a little bit. What is implicit bias in your perspective?
Absolutely. Yeah. So implicit bias is that unconscious belief or viewpoint on others, and it shows up more than people realize. And, I've done a lot of discussions around implicit bias, and so interesting to realize that people only see implicit bias in one way, as like a black and white experience, but implicit bias is just really a preference of like the things that you prefer or a response to an experience that you had before. So it could be that you have a preference or bias towards a store or towards a specific, freeway or towards a color or, a certain car, right? There's people that are like Ford or Dodge or Chevy, right? There's like, if you're like a Chevrolet person, you're not going with Ford because you're biased against Ford because of your viewpoints on Ford, because of what Ford stands for. Like, and that's the bias that I was raised with, right? I was raised as a Chevy girl. So, there's people that have biases towards something based on their preference. If you had a dangerous stimuli, your brain remembers that and it categorizes that. It's like, okay, that experience wasn't pleasurable. That was risky and dangerous. I'm not going to do that again, right? And so we begin to categorize things. And unfortunately, what happens in some of the negative impacts are around race when people have a bias towards or a preference towards how somebody looks or they show up, or there's even a bias around beauty standards, right? Like not personally, but like someone may say like, I prefer somebody that looks this way, or if somebody looks this way, then that's not, I don't like that, right? So biases show up in different ways. And for me, what I try to help people realize is that everybody's biased. Everybody has a bias. It just depends on what are those biases, how do they show up, and do they manifest into a way of discriminating or stereotyping others to where it's causing a negative outcome towards that person, right? And so it can show up in the classroom where a teacher may be biased towards a white student over a black kid. It could be biased in the child welfare system where, they may look at like, oh, this little black boy, he, has been through so much, so his future is going to look like this. So we're going to place him with a family that can help him with that. Or because this is so much, we're not going to place him with that really nice family over there because he could bring that trauma to them, right? And we don't want to ruin that nice little family's, setup or ruin them as a caregiver. So I've seen things like that where they are thinking about how, what this child looks like, how they show up, their trauma, and the impact that can have on the caregiver, and protecting more of the caregiver than they do the child themselves. And I'll say just for reference, because I do believe that it's important for this conversation, while I identify as a black woman, I was actually raised by my white family. And so I was raised from 0 to 17 by white people in a very white community where racism was rampantly through that community. I grew up with Confederate flags in the parking lot of my high school and being called the N-word. And so, the idea of, can a white family raise a black person? Yes. Will that black person be able to live in their true, authentic black body and self? I don't know, because I wasn't able to. I wasn't able to embrace that side or really understand that side or behaviors or, internalized, perception of myself as a black woman until later in life. And so it required a lot of work to understand, what were those biases that were placed upon me? What were those values and beliefs and perceptions that were placed upon me through white lens, through white people? What did I hold on to? How am I then furthering that perpetuation of white community and culture? How is that harmful to myself? How is that harmful to my black family and the black community that I love so much?
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. My wife is in a similar, she's, her mother's white and her dad's black. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people misconstrue about her often is that she's not African American. So they think that everything applies to her because she looks black. But she's from the UK and her dad's via Jamaica. So, it doesn't necessarily apply, if that makes sense. And she doesn't relate to some things. And so those assumptions, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I love Jamaica. I am not Jamaican, but I'm Jamaican. They have adopted me. It's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place, beautiful community, beautiful culture. And it's so ironic that you mentioned the UK. I've done, implicit bias training. I do a lot of trainings, and implicit bias is one of them. And I've had people from the UK in my trainings, and they always say they're like, America is so interesting. Everything's so racist there. They're like, here it's not racist. It's classist. It's very classist. But race, they're always so astonished by how much emphasis and discrimination is placed upon race. And they've just told me, the people that I've interacted with have said that there it's more about class and what status do you have. So it's very interesting that you share that.
Yeah, and I think over there too, in Europe in general, it's more like things are split up by countries here where, it's the United States. So it tries to fit under, this
one umbrella.
Yeah, one umbrella. And I had a thought and it just slipped through my mind. I think, are you familiar with, Ibram X. Kendi and the anti-racist movement and all that?
Anti-racist movement, yes.
Yeah, so one of the things that I still have trouble, like, just completely grasping, like, how we move forward and how we look at things is that I believe, like, based on the knowledge that I know, that just the further you go back, the less, obviously, race is important. And I think that when you all go to the roots is that, you know, we're going to find more, obviously, it's going to be more similarities than differences. I think a lot of that's been proven biologically. But in the anti-racist movement, we're asked to look at everything from the perspective of race. And so I think that we need to do, I also think that we need to do that in some cases because of the history and the reality. But then if that's the way that we're looking at it, then that's kind of a racist way to look at it. Not a vitriolic racist way to look at it, but it is a racist way to look at it because we're perceiving everything via race when that's not accurate. Again, like just the example of your thing versus like my friend Haki Shakur in Virginia versus my wife, who's also black, but, you know, from Europe and Jamaica. There's so many, we're also so much the same, but we're also so much very, very, very different. You know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we reconcile that and move forward in a way that we're understanding ourselves and each other better, we're understanding our biases, but we're also able to get to a place where we're more togetherness and more connected versus, I think a lot of times what results in us using the race first thing is that it can lead to a little bit of division. Not a little bit, but a lot of division sometimes. And give me just 1 second.
Take your
What's up,
time.
Leah? I love you too.
That is content that has to stay. That
I'll
is
leave it.
so cute.
We have a thing out here, you know, we're out here in Alaska by ourselves and our family. We got friends out here, obviously, but we have a togetherness rule that since we're out here by ourselves, we always go together. And so you see me walking around the university, I always got a kid with me. So it's just
It's
part of our
beautiful.
value system.
I love it. And I love that you shared that as your value system. You know, we talk about togetherness and finding ways to understand, respect, and acknowledge the race aspect, right? Which is like black, white, brown, like all, yes, but also value system, culture. For me, I like to start with that. I like to understand what is your culture, what are your values, because you know, you shared, you know, your wife is black, I identify as black, your friend, you know, he's black, but we all come from different areas and we have different backgrounds. We have had different value systems poured into us. We have a different culture behind that. And so if we give time and space to understand those aspects, then we can come together more because we'll find similarities. And maybe it's not a similarity, but it's like ooh, I like that. That's really cool. Let me find out more about it. Or, you know what, that's a different perspective that I haven't been exposed to. Can you tell me more about it? You know, I tell people when talking about implicit bias and culture and so forth, I'm like, don't just hear somebody say, oh, in my culture, this is what we do, and you keep the discussion going. For me, I want to pause. Wait, what is your culture? Tell me more about it, right? I was actually doing a training in person in San Diego for a school district, and we were talking, it was on implicit bias, and someone in the back of the room rose her hand and she was talking. She's like, oh yeah, in my culture, and I let her finish. And then my immediate response is, well, can you help us in the room understand what your culture is? And she paused and looked at me like, you can't see. And I'm like, you know, she didn't do that, but like, that's how she looked at me. And I was like, yeah, like explain what your culture is. And she was like, well, you know, it took her a moment to have to think. She's like, well, I'm Hispanic, Spanish speaking. And she went down the list. I'm like, you know, thank you for letting us know. I never want to look at somebody and just assume that I know when they say that in their culture, that I know what their culture is. Culture is not something that can always just show up on the face, right? It's like, what's your culture? How are you raised? What are your values? How do you identify? What does that mean to you, right? If we just looked at your wife and said, oh, that's a black woman walking. No, ma'am, that's a Jamaican. That's somebody from the UK. That is somebody that has a rich culture, has values, has a subset, has lived in Hawaii, Alaska. There's so many things that have added into who she is that we can't just look at people and just say, oh, based on race, that's a black person over there, and that's how I'm going to view them because that's how I view all black people. We're missing the mark because we don't understand who that person is. We don't know what their culture is, what their values are, how they perceive themselves and the world. And when we can have those type of conversations, then we won't be so boxed into a race. We will now have an outer box of also values and culture. And that outer box might get closer to somebody else's box where we can now connect or overlap and become more of a community as opposed to an individualized society. When we continue to be an individualized society just within our race, then we ourselves are continuing to perpetuate a white supremacy culture, because individualizing is part of that and it's a characteristic. And that's, for me, how I, as an individual, because I can't change the world, but how I speak out and share out my viewpoint of how we can begin to move forward in this conversation of community, and not allowing the past biases or viewpoints on singular race continue to harm our progress as we move forward in a cultural community.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think there's a new kind of movement. I don't know if you call it movement a term that's being thrown around a lot in recent years, and that's kinship. And I think a lot of indigenous folks are using it as kinship with the land, kinship with natural environment, with animals, things like that. But also, I think kinship between humans. And I think that what you and I are doing right now, it's building kinship. We're both into social work. We both have interest in some of these ideas around race and things like that. We both want to, be transformative, move in the world. We want to look at things differently. And so we're building kinship just by having this dialogue, right? Yep. And that's how I view how education should be, in my opinion, and especially social work education, right? We should be fostering connections. When I look back to especially like undergraduate education and whatnot, I learned a lot in the classroom and the stuff that they had us do, but to be honest with you, like much of the most meaningful information, the most transformative experience I had was dialoguing with other students, with the professors outside of the classroom, things like that. But oftentimes when you go to a classroom, and especially outside of social work, but even in social work, often it's like the banking model of education. It's transaction. It's a transaction, right? You're going to go pay for your tuition. You're going to come to the classroom. You're going to sit in rows. Teacher's going to deliver a lecture. You're going to have a book to read. They're going to give you some exams. Maybe you're going to have to write a paper. And now in this post-pandemic, it's even worse because oftentimes classes are online. Folks aren't meeting in person. And so, the Zoom room, not saying nobody ever stays in the Zoom and chats, but for the most part, people dip out. Whereas in a classroom, people are lingering around, chatting with each other, talking about things, fostering connections between their peers, between their professors. And so I believe, and you talked about this a lot, being aware of your power, right? So me as a professor, as a teacher, I realize I have power, right? I can dictate whatever I want. I could tell you, I could sit here and profess whatever the hell I want to you if that's what I so wanted to do. But I don't believe I don't even totally buy into the term professor, because in some ways, I'm more of a curator, I've been around for a long time. I know a lot of things. I've read a lot. And so I've thought about things that you haven't had, that maybe some of my students haven't had a chance to. And so it's my opportunity to present some of that stuff to you and foster opportunities for dialogue, for connection. So we call talking circles oftentimes. But, how do you see that? How do you see education? You're a professor as well. How do you foster that sense of connection in your students?
I love this. Yes. So I've been in my professorship since before the pandemic. So I think I'm maybe year 3 or 4. I don't know. But it's been a really exciting journey. And we started online. I started in person and then quickly went to online. In this semester, I taught 3 courses in person, and it was really exciting in the graduate program, MSW program. And I feel the same way. All of my formal education, I have a bachelor's in social work from San Diego State, a master's in social work from Cal State East Bay. It was sit, listen, lecture. And we had group discussion, we had interaction, we had, community. I vividly remember one class where it was like the high-rise seating where you just sit there and just listen to an older person talk, and that was great. I'll tell this story really quick. I remember when I first was accepted for to teach, and I called one of my professors. It was Dr. Homan, love her. She is no longer teaching, but she, is a retired teacher from San Diego State, is a accomplished published writer. And I called her. She's an older white woman, and I was like, I was messaging her, and I was like, I'm so nervous. I'm really young. I'm a Black woman. Like, what do I do? Like, how are the students going to perceive me? And she was just like, Maria, yes, some students are going to go to school and going to expect this type of professor, but some are going to go and they're going to need somebody like you. And I was like, understood. So be myself. And so that was a few years ago. Fast forward to this year, I wanted to provide a classroom environment where they can thrive and learn. I am a social worker through and out, and so the way that even I teach my pedagogy is social work, like bringing them through the generous model. We built rapport, we communicated, they know the end date, they know what to expect, everything was clarity, they knew what we were doing. In class, we would have a lot of group discussion where it wasn't just me talking. I want them to be able to learn how to communicate about this material across differences and across the room and in small groups. And so we had a lot of discussion. I would tell them, the book is important. You need to read it. You need to know this stuff because this is the foundation of social work. This is the core of social work. And you need to know how to discuss it and how to expand your thought process around it. And not just only know the textbook, because I remember I was doing a guest lecture at a different university, and a student was like, "But wasn't this all developed?" I was talking about motivation interviewing, and they're like, "Well, wasn't this developed by white guys?" And I was just like, yes, but your entire program was developed by white guys. Like the entire social work curriculum, like everything that you're learning. So learn it and then learn how to adapt it to your community and to your clients and to the work that you're doing. So that's a lot of what I would do, is bring in my applicable experiences to the material, and then help students begin to learn how to adapt it for themselves. I told my students day one, these were, first semester social work students. Throughout the semester, I told them, embrace being a social worker now. Do not wait until you graduate to begin to embody the thought process of a social worker. These next 2 years are your formative years to learn how to utilize this material as a social worker. So you need to start thinking about that now. It's going to be harmful if you wait for 2 years until you walk across a stage to then identify as a social worker, because the community sees you as a social worker now, even though you're, an intern or whatnot, however you feel. You are a social worker. You need to start behaving that way and interacting and communicating that way so you can support the clients and grow in that. I just talked to a student who graduated from a different university, and I talked to her yesterday, and it was interesting to hear that she has graduated with her MSW and is feeling this imposter syndrome, as if she can't embrace social work. And I looked at her profile, and she doesn't even have MSW updated on her profile. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, what a miss for the last few years that she had in that program with those professors that never told her, start feeling and embracing social work. That now she's graduated, walked the stage, and doesn't even feel that. For me, my pedagogy is we're having clarity today. We're engaging in conversation. We're growing this perspective as a social worker, and the material that you are being educated with through this textbook, you're seeing it through the lens of a social worker, and not the lens of, I don't know who I am yet, right? Like, we're not just doing the work as busy work. I would always say this assignment, this reading, this material is applicable to real world or the work as a social worker in this way. And if you think it's not, let's talk about it, because I'm here for that discussion too.
Yeah, and I think I had a lot of thoughts on what you were saying, so I appreciate that. But, even circling, thinking about implicit bias, right? It's the things we take for granted. Mm-hmm. And I think as a social work educator, again, back to these transaction environments, students have been kind of conditioned to look at it that way. And so say just one example, students coming into an intro to social work course. Well, I think oftentimes, I present the question, what is social work at the beginning? And they expect me to answer it for them. And so I say to them, you think I'm going to answer that for you, right? But if I could just answer it for you on the first day of class, that's much too simple, right?
Right.
And so the whole time you were talking, I was thinking, our job as educators, extends beyond just the transaction of me giving you some knowledge. But it's, especially in social work, right? We have to help them and give them the tools to create values. And so back to the transaction, oftentimes students would come in and say, okay, well, you're supposed to tell me what the social work values are. Well, I can tell you what many people perceive social work values to be, and I can give you values from the NASW and different things like that. But ultimately, you need to create your own sense of values with that. And so I view that as a big responsibility of mine, is to help students do that. And, it's hard because students are at different levels. Sometimes I've got a student that is 50 years old and is retired from the military and has loads and loads of life experiences and challenges. And then you might have a 19-year-old student who, just not saying they don't have any life experience, but they don't have the life experience of a 50-year-old military veteran or, somebody that's been out there forever.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have any ways that you try to co-create knowledge, values with your social work students?
Yeah, we did a couple activities early on in the semester. We definitely looked at the NASW Code of Ethics values because I wanted, it was part of the curriculum, but also it's important to understand what the values of social work are, but then also, as you mentioned, build upon those values, be comfortable having conversations about values, because I encourage my clients, my students and people that I train to go out and have those conversations with clients, right? What are the values of your client? What values do your clients hold? And then not just asking them what are the values, but asking them what are their personal definitions around those values, because we can each view the value differently. Another thing that we would do at the beginning was building rapport within the classroom, so we can have that community experience, right? So, we went around and people introduced themselves, and, as they were introducing themselves, I was like, okay, well, who in here has children, right? Okay, cool. So now we have connection, we have community. Who in here, has this experience or this experience, right? And so we would just kind of build community in that way, so they wouldn't feel so alone in that moment. And from day one, walking into the classroom until the end of the semester, the community, the vulnerability, and the support that they had within that classroom environment truly grew each day. I had them design their own eco maps so they could identify what's in their subsystems, and then have conversations with others to find commonality. Because, these are conversations that they're going to go out and have with their clients. And for me, as an educator, and someone who likes to share knowledge and share the skills of social work, it's important for me, for professionals, to experience these same things that we're going to ask our clients to experience, to know what it feels like to be vulnerable or to be asked a question that requires deep dive. And so that's how I support the students in the classroom, because that 51-year-old and that 19-year-old may not on the surface or visually see themselves as someone having connection or community, but there may be something in their ecological system or something within their hopes and fears about the classroom or something about their value that can connect them. And so finding different opportunities throughout the semester to have those show up was really important. And I know for myself, I was the person who was always on the younger end in school, because I went straight through everything. And so I was making friends with the 50-year-olds in the classroom because I was the 19-year-old, and they were the older people. But there were often opportunities for commonality, and that's what I appreciated through my own experiences. And I wanted to create that as the educator in this opportunity.
Yeah, well, your students are lucky to have you, somebody that's imaginative, that's, looking to do things differently to foster those connections. When I look back, when I did the assignments like the eco map and genograms and things like that, they weren't super meaningful for me when we did them, but when I look back on the perspective that they gave me, more of a bird's eye view on things, it really contributed, and it helps me help my students in the present today for sure.
And I just want to say that's it. And that's our experience, right? Like, we are social workers, we have social work education. So we know the assignments, right? The assignments haven't shifted too much. So me presenting now the assignment to my classes, I already know. And I just acknowledge, same how I explain with my clients, I acknowledge with my students, I know this assignment feels like it's tedious, and it is a little bit tedious, but this is how it is going to further your career. This is where it's applicable. I know doing a genogram requires you talking to your family or pulling on some maybe past trauma, but here's how it's useful. And then once they do it, I say, now add that to your resume, add that to your repertoire of things that you can do for client engagement. Now it's applicable. Now they're connected to it. Now they have a sense of purpose and reason to do it. Same for and I share that with them, and I'm very articulate with all these things. And I'm like, this is how you embrace motivation and encourage people to engage in the process when you communicate and show them and build, in purpose in that. So, yes.
And just to add some perspective on that from my experience, when I think I took that class as it was human behavior in the social environment. I think I took it as a junior or something. But when I completed my genogram, it's hard for me to, when you look backwards, it's hard to remember exactly the way you thought about things or how you saw things. But I used to really have a lot of distaste for the question of introduce yourself and share about your family and your culture, your ancestry, because I really didn't know how to answer those questions. And I think that's a problem for white folks and for many people, but for white folks, because you never really broke it down like that. You look at other cultures as these distinct cultures, but you really don't see yourself that way. But anyway, so asked to do a genogram. I didn't know anything beyond the grandparents that I knew personally, before they passed away and whatnot. But now, fast forward, what was this, 6-7 years ago? Now, if somebody were to ask me to introduce myself in that way, especially, because I work with a lot of indigenous people, indigenous communities, so that's the way indigenous folks introduce themselves, starting with ancestry and whatnot. Now I can go through both my maternal sides, both my paternal sides, and I can tell you all about my ancestry and all about everything because, that seed was planted back then when I did that genogram, and it made me a little bit curious, and I looked deeper. And now I know not just to introduce myself better, but I know myself better, and I know where I came from, and I know, what the people were doing and why some things about why they did things and how they got there. And so I don't agree with everything from my ancestry and with the things that they did or thought about, but I guess one of the things that were fortunate for me is there wasn't anything that bad. I was always terrified I was going to fall upon slave owners or something, and I didn't. Quite the opposite, but. And even if that was say that slave driver was in there, it's better for me to know that, right? To know what's going through me historically and whatnot. And so take those assignments seriously and keep digging, because it may be hard to answer and to look at some of those things, but again, I'm talking about over half a decade later, so it takes years really for things, and even longer for things to really manifest themselves. So just because you don't find something super meaningful in the moment, don't take it for granted that it might be a seed that might, grow into something more beautiful in the future for you.
Absolutely.
I think before I went off on that, I had another question I wanted to ask you, and my short-term memory since I became a professor is terrible because I have so many interactions with people.
Yes, I get it.
Okay, let's do this since we're getting close on time. Not that we don't have an exact cutoff time, but I like to keep them about 90 minutes. You have a book that you're working on, right?
Yes.
What's that all about?
Okay, so my book is Redefining Time, and it's really looking at, oftentimes people think about time management as I have to be a good time manager, and if I can't manage my time well, then I'm not going to be successful. It's this pivotal experience of if you can, great, you can succeed. If you can't, boom. And it's thought about everyone that is successful was able to manage their time well. For me, scrap all of that. It's not necessarily about being a great time manager. It's about managing your tasks and managing the tasks that you have in front of you within the time frame that you have allotted. And so with time management, people think if I have a day off, if I'm lazy, if I procrastinate, if I if I don't think I have enough time, then I'm just not even going to start something. So it limits their goals, it limits their potential, it limits their perception of like what's available to them in their life. For me, I'm more task-based focused, and that's what I strive in. But when I look at tasks, I actually, and I had to look back at like, how do I do this? I manage tasks within time frames. So I actually look at it backwards. Some people go time management and then look at the task. I look at the task and I'm like, okay, these are the things that will need to happen. How much time do I have? And so I may have a large goal, like, oh, I want to go back to school and study this degree, and it's going to take me 3 years. Oh, 3 years is so long. I don't want to do that, right? That's what people may say. But for me, I'm like, well, I need to go back to school. It's going to be 3 years. I'm going to have 3 years of life, hopefully anyways. So what do I need to do to progress? So I break it down backwards towards task. I need to complete an application. Well, the application process is really lengthy. Let me not get overwhelmed by that. What's incorporated in it? Okay, I need to get letters of rec. Need to do an application. Need to do a letter. So I break it down into tasks. And so in my book, what I explain is, well, first in my book, my introduction is where I start out as a young 20-year-old living my best life, and then I find out that I'm pregnant. And so it's actually a very clear description of me having that conversation with my friend, and then going to the venue and finding out that I'm actually pregnant with a child. And so I talk about that. I talk about the loss of my father, and I talk about different points in my life where I absolutely had opportunity to like take a step back and not continue to progress. I had opportunity to really get discouraged and not feel like internal motivation to move forward in life. But I was like, nope, let me just take this moment. Let me feel this moment. And then let me see what I need to do to get back on track. And so I tell it through my own stories. I brought in research. I brought in other people's stories as well, and experiences of how you can break down a large goal into strategies and objectives, and then through that find out different tasks. And so in my book, I talk about if you have, a couple hours, look at your task list and break it up into what can you do during that time frame. Also, what do you have the capacity to do? And then what can you move on for the next day, right? Like, don't overwhelm yourself. And I also say, if you only have 15 minutes or you have a 15-minute break, is it necessary to keep pushing yourself, or should you actually go outside and take a walk and take like a 10-minute break and just get fresh air? And I always encourage people to just go outside and get fresh air and take a walk instead of keep pushing yourself. Because every time that I've done that for myself, I actually come back in and I'm more productive for the rest of the day than I would have been if I keep pushing myself. And so I just talk about different things like that throughout my book, because my goal and my hope is that throughout the book, people are reading it, they're inspired, they're engaging in the activities that I have throughout the book, and by the end of the book, they're moving towards reaching their own full potential of how can they achieve a goal that they want to have. I did a little pre-sale book tour earlier this year, and at one of my events, somebody was like talking and wanted to know more about the book, and I was like, and she's like, oh yeah, I have a goal of playing the guitar, but I just haven't started, and I haven't done this, I haven't done that. And then I kind of just like thought about it, and I'm like, playing the guitar is not necessarily like a goal in itself. Like, what are you trying to gain from that? Like, what, and then we, talked about that, and I broke it down all the way down to finding just do it like a Google search for classes, right? Just do find a guitar, find a place to play, find music that you want to play, break it down into smaller manageable tasks that will eventually move you towards reaching that goal. And when I did that for her, she just was like lit up, like, oh wow, right? Like she thought that she had to jump from like today to tomorrow being able to play the guitar. But there's so many things in between today and playing the guitar that can be worked towards to be able to learn. And so my book does that. I'm really excited about it. It comes out spring 2024. So it goes to print in February 16th. And I'm really, really excited because it's my first book. I'm under publishing contract, so it's not a self-published, but I have a publisher. It's going to be a beautiful book. I just submitted the mocks for my cover, And I'm really excited. I'm telling stories I've never told before. It's very vulnerable. It's very personal. And I'm telling people how I do it. It's the number one question I get asked. How do you do it? How do you do it all? What did you do? What pathways did you take? And I often don't know how to answer that question. But I realized that like a 17 chapter book with over 30,000 words will help somebody. So that's what I did.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, like I was saying earlier, you know, the answers to those kind of questions, they need to come in long form. And people may find them in shorter spurts, but they really do. They need to be produced in long form. You got to flesh them out.
Yep.
You have a title for it?
Redefining time. It's a practical guide, yeah, to reaching your full potential.
Redefining time. Well, keep us updated on that, and I'll attach it to everything later on when it comes out, and I'd love to get a copy of it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Well, as we close things out, I always like to end with, you know, a kind of a harder critical question, like digging deeper into social work. And there's actually two sides. I have two questions in one for you to close things out. You know, you talk about working with system-involved families. And so the first thing I want to know is on the more positive side is like, what strategies do you have to empower those families? And then the critical side of it, I want to know, what about when there's a conflict, like, you know, from the system that you work for, per se, and they want you to do something, and you feel like that doesn't align with what you think the family needs or with the values of the family? How do you navigate that?
Absolutely.
How do you empower it, and how do you navigate a conflict like that?
Yes. So, and I use system involved. It's often more recently being referred to as system impacted. And as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, systems for me, there's a plethora of systems. It's education, medical, criminal, child welfare, and so forth. I've worked inside the child welfare system, and I also work with clients that are in other systems, and I've worked alongside, education and medical. When I think about working with these clients and ways to empower them is through collaboration and partnership, to respect the client's autonomy, to provide as much choice and control as possible for the client, to remember that I'm not the expert, but the client is the expert. They're the expert in their life. And I share this with people and I'm like, hello, your clients are the expert. Who's asking the questions? You're asking the questions. They have the answer. They have the answer because they're the expert. They know it's their life. And so for me, holding on to those being a part of who I am innately, how I communicate, how I engage, how I educate others is how I work to empower and share power and give that to the communities that I interface with. Yeah. The second question was, remind me?
Just an example, say your place of employer is the system.
Oh, right.
A system,
yes.
And you have a family or a client, and you feel like something doesn't align, value-based or what they need. How do you manage that? Yes.
So if you cannot tell, I'm extremely vocal and I'm not shy. And especially when it comes to the communities and as a Black social worker to the Black community. And so I'm very communicative of that. I thankfully, when I worked inside the system, I had a really good rapport with my colleagues and those that I worked with and worked around. And my assessments were well respected, and I appreciate that. And that was because of how I worked and how I communicated and my intentions behind that. And so I was very, very few and little times where a decision there was a disconnect. There was one time where there was a disconnect, and it was unfortunate. A child was not going to be returned to a parent's care. It's not what I wanted, because my heart wanted to return, and the decision was to not. And looking back, it probably was the right decision to not return. Just thinking about the trajectory of the parents and where they are now and what's happened. And that was really hard for me, really hard, sleepless nights because of it. But it was a decision that that was actually supportive. It was supportive, and I could have done harm by returning. I can't recall too many other times where there was a disconnect, and that's because my focus was doing right by clients. The agency that I worked for knew that, and I was really, really fortunate to work in a system and work around colleagues and have supportive management, if you will, leadership that understood that and supported that and actually trained me to be like that. So I don't have too many situations where there was a disconnect. What I do encourage people is to do thorough assessments and to engage your clients and build that rapport. So if there is a disconnect, you're able to explain to the agency why you make this assessment, and you're able to hold firm in a professional manner that decision that you're making, and you're able to communicate with your clients as well. Now, I know that my clients, I know that and I still am, but when I worked in the system, I was the system, right? I knew that I was a system for my clients, so I would communicate with them around that. But I'd also communicate in a way where I'd let them know that the system that I work for, the agency that I work for, this is what they expect and this is what they're going to be looking for, so that I could humanize myself with the client as I work with them, so that they can see me in that respect, and so that they know that when decisions are made or assessments are made, it's made through my professional lens, on behalf of the agency. But also, here's some things that as a social worker and as a human communicating with you, I can support you around, or I can advocate for you to get that support. So I would say, you need to talk to your attorney about this. You need to make sure your attorney's aware of this. If you haven't talked to your advocate, your parent advocate, here's some things you should. Or you really, at the next court hearing, you really need to be there. You really need to bring your family there. You really need to have supports there. Or if you want this favorable outcome, even like say my assessment or my recommendation to the court would be against the parent's will, right? Like maybe it would not to be reunified. I would still tell that parent or that family, I know you disagree with the recommendation. You absolutely should. You have the right to do that. You have a right to a fair trial. And these are the things that you can do between now and that date to have progress, to move forward and come to the next court hearing with this, this, and this, and this. Give your attorney this information so that they have an argument on your side. And I would tell them, here are ways that you can argue this. Here are some things that you can do to work against this. And so for me, I was an agent of the agency and I held that position, and I believe I did that very well. And also, I'm a social worker, I'm a human, I'm a Black mother, first and foremost, a wife to a Black man, and that is the energy that I come with for my families, and they know that. And I would make sure that they knew ways that they can navigate the system that I work for, because I want to empower. I don't want to disempower. And knowledge for me is power. So anytime I can share that knowledge and thoughts with my clients, I can empower them to know how to respond to the system that they're being oppressed by.
Yeah, and again, I said this before, but one of the things I really appreciate about the way that you answer the questions about these things, and the way that you say that you deal with these families, these people, these situations, is that you do it by being candid, by being honest, by keeping it real, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
And people appreciate that, and it can be hard. And one of the negative places that I sometimes see social workers fall into is really trying to play both sides of the fence, but without being able to be honest about it, because you can't. Sometimes the truths around things can be hard to accept, but even if they're hard to accept, we need to be able to confront them along with the people that we're working with, so that we have an accurate appraisal of what's going on, so that the people trust us.
Yep.
That mutual respect.
Yep.
And so there's a term that's used internationally, but we don't use it so much here in the United States yet, and it's called revolutionary social work. And I think it's very similar to critical social work, as in, you want to, advocate and take on the systems and create change in that way. But I think where revolutionary social work comes in different, it's that everything's always revolutionizing. We're not taking things for granted. And I think that's often a problem with systems, right? They become so deeply entrenched, and they're not revolutionizing to meet the current needs and the current situations, the people. And so from what I hear from you, is that, not only in addition to your honesty, in addition to being candid, but I sense that sense of being a revolutionary social worker in that you're trying to create change, but you're doing that oftentimes through reflection and through starting inward and letting that manifest outwards into the people that you work with in the worlds that you inhabit. And so I do this once in a while, but I just want to crown you. I don't have a crown for you, but I want to crown you as a revolutionary social worker. And I just want to say thank you for not only for dialoguing with me this morning and taking the time to share your thoughts, wisdom, and experience with everybody that's going to be tuning in. But just thank you for making a difference and for being who you are. And I'm sure you know it too. We all have a long ways to go, no matter how far we've come.
Wow.
But yeah, I just want to say thanks for being a revolutionary social worker. Thanks for all the work that you do, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to share it with us.
Thank you so much, and I really, really, really appreciate you. And that's why I have my brand, my merch brand, Social Worker Period, because I'm a social worker, period, and it's who I am, and it's what I do, and I love it so much. So I really, really appreciate you just acknowledging just my perspective on how to do this work. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and let's stay in touch. I'm sure we can connect again, especially when that book comes out.
Yes.
You should come back on. We should
Please,
chat about it again.
Please, I'll be here. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time. Have a great day, and I'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you, Christian.
All right. Peace.
Bye.
This episode of The Critical Social Worker was recorded live on Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. And this episode featured Marya Wright, and it was hosted by Christian Ace Stettler. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, this has been a Conscious Party production. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, everybody, until next time, keep being revolutionary. Peace.